Welcome to Voices of Veterans podcast. My name is Dan Hamilton. I am really excited to have today with me Eric Burleson. We are going to talk about his book that has just been released. We're going to talk about his experience transitioning from Special Forces to an MBA program at the University of Texas. But before I get too deep into that, Eric, thank you for being here. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to the point where you're at currently today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate being here today. So I joined the Army. I enlisted in 2005 after finishing my undergrad at the University of North Texas and joined a program called the 18 X-ray program. It was a Special Forces pipeline for non-prior service soldiers. So I went through infantry school and airborne school, went through a selection prep course, and then selection and the Special Forces qualification course, what we call the Q course. I finished that in 2007 and was assigned to 5th Special Forces Group, where I served for the following 6 years. I separated in 2013. And from there, I went to McCombs, the UT McCombs School of Business, to earn an MBA. I finished that in 2015. I had started a company while I was in business school and handed that over to one of my peers in business school and joined a company called Invoto here in Austin. It's an e-commerce company working as a partnerships director and as a product manager. And from there was recruited into Google by someone I actually met in Iraq in 2010. He had served in the Ranger Regiment, and we had shared an operations center and knew each other pretty well. And he brought me in to work in the cloud organization at Google. And one of the things about separating that kind of led me to my interest in neuroscience and what ultimately led to writing this book, as I was separating, there were a rash of suicides in my unit. There was a lot of focus on the mental health challenges of Special Operations Forces in particular and service members in general at that time. I got married in 2013, and as I was separating, basically, I decided to leave the Army, separated, got married, moved across the country back to Texas from Kentucky. My wife got pregnant on our honeymoon.
Wow.
And
a lot
started
of
business
transition
school.
all at once, huh?
Yeah, so a pro tip for veterans who are separating, don't do that, all right?
Move at a little bit slower pace.
Try and spread out all of the major transitional life changes over maybe a wider period of time, because that was insane.
How long had you been married for at that point?
We got married in March of 13. Okay. I officially separated in July of 13. At the beginning of 13, I deployed to Saudi Arabia. So I deployed, came back, got married the next week, went on transition leave the next week. A couple months later, officially transitioned out, and the week after that, started business school. And my daughter was born in February of 14.
That's incredible.
So what I realized in business school is that the entire context of what I knew to be true and what I knew about how to interact with people and where I was had totally changed. And I know that you attended college after separating too, so I think that you can probably relate to this. It was weird having conversations with people who hadn't served, who didn't know all of the traditions and history about the military, had totally different vocabulary. Sort of all of my fundamental assumptions about the way the world worked had basically changed. It was incredibly stressful, and so I started going to therapy because it was really overwhelming me. It was overwhelming my family, my home life.
Was that something you took initiative in, or was that something
absolutely.
that family pushed you towards?
No, it was something that I took initiative in. I had lost some family and friends to suicide, and I'd started having some pretty dark and suicidal thoughts, and it was getting to a point where I knew that this was something that I had to take care of. It was critical to my health. It was critical to the health of my family. And I have no other way to say this except that in that process, I was absolutely fascinated by what was happening to me.
So you were interested, while you're going through this transition, you're leaving the service, you're raising a kid, you're trying to get your MBA, and you're reflecting on what the process is that your body and your mind and your heart are going through, right?
Absolutely.
That's kind of what launched your interest into neuroscience, if I'm correct.
Yeah, that's largely true. There were several different interests that sort of converged. I had listened to this podcast, and I can't remember exactly where I found it, but it was David Eagleman talking about the subconscious, and he's a neuroscientist out of Baylor University. And that led me to another guy named Norman Doidge, who wrote a book called The Brain That Changes Itself. That's about neuroplasticity. And so I had some familiarity with neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain to literally, physically change itself. It means that as you learn new things according to different kinds of stimuli, your brain will restructure itself in order to optimize those kinds of thought patterns, which is a terrific way to save a lot of time and energy in like your day-to-day life, so long as nothing is changing. But because a transition is such a fundamentally massive change, it takes time for your brain to react to those new kinds of stimuli. And so that's part of the reason why it's so stressful.
Right, so it's kind of like, I always go back to the metaphor that a ball at rest tends to stay at rest, a ball in motion tends to stay at motion. And I think what you're telling the audience, if I understand it correctly, is your brain operates in a certain way, the ball starts rolling, right? It's like the military pushes the ball starts rolling, it has a certain pattern or a certain groove, and that's the same thing that your mind is doing. It's operating on a certain plane, so it teaches you how to fight or flight. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, the direction that ball is rolling is no longer productive to your current circumstances in a civilian world. And you have to rewire your brain, or you have to change the direction of the ball.
Yeah, so that's a really apt metaphor, and let's take that a couple steps further. Suppose that this ball is rolling down this real familiar groove, right? And stimuli come in, and those kind of represent different sections within the groove, where like, okay, everything is fine, these are decisions I'm familiar with, these are contexts I'm familiar with, the ball can keep rolling in that groove. But then all of a sudden you're placed in a new situation where the ball has to sit up on the banks of the groove. Or even worse, like close to the middle of the groove, but just on the inside. So it becomes really super easy for the ball to just slide right back into that groove, unless you push it completely out of it, and then you're totally out of context. And that's kind of what's happening with the brain, is that you encounter these situations that seem familiar, and so your brain immediately jumps into these particular solution sets, but they're not the same thing. They're totally different. You might see, for example, something that a lot of veterans are real familiar with, looking at hands, and like people having their hands in their pockets, or people pulling things out, and especially in a context where there's a lot of crowds and you get activated. You start getting really aroused and like looking for all these different kinds of threats. And the context is right, and the context is just totally different. But you have to consciously think about the context being really different to subvert that activation instead of responding to it immediately.
So it was one of the points of growth while you're understanding about this, about your process, and while you're learning about it in a scientific set, you had to understand that it was happening to you, and you had to say that that's okay, or you had to realize that I realize that this is happening to me. I'm in a classroom, I feel uncomfortable. I'm in a crowd of people, I feel uncomfortable. Then how do you keep that ball in the direction that you want it to, as opposed to going back into that old pattern? What worked for you?
Okay, so really interesting question. First, there's tremendous stigma around mental health, especially for the veteran community. And there are a variety of reasons for that. which I won't go into right now. But basically, by understanding that this is a thing that it was basically totally out of my control, and this is a fundamental part of what it means to be human, is how our brains and how our minds function optimally, right? And when I understood that this was something utterly outside of my control and basically something that's common to the veteran experience, it totally removed that stigma. And so I could just focus on promoting my own health, doing the things that were going to help me transition well, and focus on getting the help that I need. Now, a big part of that was relaxing a little bit while I was in business school and looking at my peers and saying, you know what, you all understand all of this better than I do. Can you just help me? Like, look out for me. I have no idea what you're talking about. I think I do sometimes, but I also think I'm wrong. So let me ask some simple questions, and even more to the point, do me a favor and proactively pull me aside and stop me before I do something really ridiculous and foolish, or help me to understand things a little bit more ahead of time.
So while you're kind of understanding this context in your own self, you're also reaching out. You're reaching out externally. Mm-hmm. You're doing two things at once. So you're operating internally about, you're almost not self-diagnosing, but you're understanding what you're coming in contact with internally, and you're also reaching out for external. You're also reaching out for external accountability.
That's right.
Talk about the importance of having non-military friends after you leave the service.
Great. So we're talking about how the brain changes itself according to the stimuli that's presented to it, right? You ever heard someone say that you're the product of your 5 closest friends? Mm-hmm. So that's true.
You look like your friends, you talk like your friends. Yeah, totally.
That's true, because while you're interacting with these people, they're affecting you.
You're
and
mirroring.
Those interactions, right, will change you. They'll help your mind and your brain to function in particular ways. So if you go out of your way to find friends and to find a social circle and to find a community of people who are smarter, wiser, more accomplished than you, it cannot help you but to grow in those ways that you most seek out.
Is this something like, for some reason when I left the military, I latched onto this phrase, and it took me a year or two to go through a similar process of one, understanding something wasn't right, 2, being cognizant enough to try to fix it, and then 3, learning how to improve myself. Mm-hmm. And one of the quotes that always stuck with me, just about 2 or 3 years after I left the service, was, don't be the smartest person in the room. Go find people, even your peers, right? So if you left the service, for example, were you older than some of the people in the classroom, or especially for
by a few years?
Yes,
for sure.
Exactly. So I think for me, and I kind of want to hear what your take is on this, is I had to realize that some of the students in the classroom with me and that I was around were more adept to their surroundings, had a better understanding of how to get around campus, were more comfortable interacting with their friends, doing homework and asking questions in class. And that was a huge realization for me, that I'm not the smartest person in the room, and if I am, I need to go find another room to be in because I need to grow. Did you have a similar experience?
Definitely. So many of my peers were really accomplished in business already. They had worked in the private sector or in different roles in the public sector, and they had a much better sort of fundamental understanding of how all these things functioned. And so getting in a group of people who kind of spoke the language that I wanted to speak, and that I could say, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Like, help walk me through these things. And of course I was in a formal education environment, so a lot of that stuff was being explained to me anyway, but this was a way that I could kind of accelerate that growth, mm-hmm. and that I could have somebody that was frankly looking after me, that knew my situation a little bit more, and that was going to help me. Now, it's interesting that you brought up a lot of the people around you. Like, I was going to graduate school, so the people were a little bit older. There wasn't quite as much of a gap between me and others. But Undergrad students, what's real interesting about separating from the military is there's a concept called differentiation. And what differentiation is, for most people, is it's when they separate from their family of origin and they have to create their own kind of identity, right? But they bring the baggage of their family of origin with them into that new context. Now, when you go to college, you're basically surrounded by this massive cohort of people who are all going through the same kinds of changes. And so you don't really see it as this big, stressful kind of change. Veterans don't. We typically separate on our own. We may find some other veterans that are kind of in the same boat, but by and large, we're going through this process on our own. And so that idea of like switching contexts, it's real similar for both communities, but we have to be thoughtful about how we are going about it. We have to be really conscious about like, okay, I'm having these, what I call resonant experiences. They seem familiar to what I've experienced before, but that was then and this is now. And when you sort of call that out, really explicitly say, I'm having a feeling that reminds me of a past experience or a past context. Right.
Experience.
But that was then and this is now. I can be a little bit more aware of how I'm going to respond, and I can be a little bit more aware of how I'm going to react because it's a different situation. When you figure out that those resonant experiences don't usually have anything to do with what's happening right now, it can be a lot easier to overcome those stressful sort of experiences.
Was there any point where you ever reluctant to overcome your military reaction to things, almost like feeling like you're losing a part of yourself? You know, I did, 5 to 8 years in the service. I gave my most valuable years as a young man to the military, and almost telling yourself that you have to change who you are, rewire your brain, and associate with a different class of people. Did you ever feel like you were leaving something behind or even diminishing something that was so impactful, such as military service?
No, and I can see where one would get into that. It would be easy to be like, well, I don't want to make myself more like a civilian or take away parts of myself that are soldiering.
I think there's a lot of veterans who experience that.
I totally agree.
Want to get rid of that part.
It's almost like, well, I mean, those things serve me really well. Why would I ever want to get rid of them? I already know. But the thing is that, again, that was then and this is now. We aren't living in a combat zone. We're not living in those circumstances. We're not in the military. We're not wearing a uniform and have to observe those customs and traditions. And really, it's kind of counterproductive to do so. It doesn't make sense. Now, that doesn't take away from what we've done in service by any stretch of the imagination. And nothing can take away what we've done in our service. Like, that's part of who we are.
You're saying basically you can move on in your life after the service without actually losing what you have done and the value of that service.
Absolutely. In fact, so what I say is you differentiate first, and differentiation is the process of saying like that was then, this is now, recognizing and being conscious of that separation. The second part is integrating. You look at those things, you very consciously bring them into your present life and say, how can I use those things to serve me now? How can I use those feelings that I have, the pride I feel in getting up every day early to exercise or to take care of my life and to take care of my family? How can I bring those feelings into my present life in a way that is beneficial to everybody involved? And how can I think about the different parts of my mind and parts of my brain and bring them all together in a way that this whole insanely stressful transition process really leads to more of an awakening, a growth. And when you're on that path, it can feel really hazy and really complicated, but it's just paying attention to the little pieces day by day that starts to build those structures, starts to build that foundation.
What was the best part of transition for you?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that the best part of transition, and it's ongoing, is making sense of my military life, making sense of my current life, and pulling them together. Because there comes a point in one's transition where all of a sudden, like one day you've gone through a certain degree of integration, you look around you and you're like, oh, this is what this feels like. I belong here.
Yeah.
I'm in a place where I feel comfortable,
Yeah.
and not just comfortable, but really confident.
Yeah.
And the awakening, I mean, it's like you've been walking around in black and white, and all of a sudden everything's in color. And you don't know how to describe that to someone who's never been there, right? It's just like, I use this analogy in my book where it's like you and I are riding on a river rapid down the river, right? And I like say, hey, check out these clouds and how bright the sun looks. And you're yelling at me saying, why aren't you paddling? Do you see around us? We have all these rocks. We're going to die if you don't paddle. Like, quit looking at the sky, man. And I just sort of pick up the paddle and maybe scoop a couple of ways.
Yeah.
But by that point, I really know the river pretty well, and I can see a whole lot more. I can't explain to you what it feels like to look at the sun or to look at those clouds. All I can do is say, hey, trust me. We're in this river together. You're going to get to that point.
Don't you think it's some part of wondering if civilian life has to supersede your military experiences, or if your military experiences supersede what you've done as a civilian? Like, at some point, did you ever think, wow, I don't know if I'm going to be able to accomplish as a civilian what I was able to accomplish in the military? Or did you not go through that thought process?
Let's take it a step back and much more concrete, right? Because that's a lot of worrying about what I did in the past and what I might do in the future. The only thing you can affect is today, right now. So today, the present, absolutely supersedes everything that happened before and absolutely supersedes anything that might happen later. All I can focus on is where I am today, and the greatest extent, recognizing where I am today as opposed to thinking about where I was before or where I might be tomorrow, and thinking about what is the next best thing I can do, what is the next right thing I can do right now, and how can I do it to the best of my ability? How can I bring as much of what I have to offer the world to this present moment today? And that really takes a lot of effort to think about connecting with where you are today and where you've come, and bringing everything that you know into today, and then knowing that I can work towards things in the future, but ultimately it's just right now that matters.
And so what was the sorry, I lost my train of thought. So what was the 2 or 3 things that you realized that you needed to do today during your transition that helped you get through that entire process? If you came to this realization that says, I can't worry about what happened in the past, I can't worry about in the future, I'm focused on right now, what was most important to you in that right now moment that helped you become successful through school, then start a business, and then go on to work at Google?
The first thing that I realized was that I could no longer numb myself out of today. That meant I had to quit drinking. That meant I had to stop distracting myself from what was happening right now. That meant I had to stop worrying about whether or not my marriage was going to make it, and instead work on improving it right now. It's real easy for us to just be nostalgic and sort of live in what happened before, and we just can't do that. That's not ultimately going to serve where we are. So understanding that I needed help to do those things, to pay attention to what was going to help me function my best today, and then cutting out the things in my life that weren't going to serve that purpose. I think that probably the most profound thing that I could do was quit drinking and take care of my sleep. They're the simplest things.
Yeah, I know.
But having good sleep hygiene and quitting alcohol probably did more for my mental health than anything else.
Now that the audience has heard your story, they've heard about trying to live in the present, and they've even understood some of maybe the aspects internally that are going on with our mind as veterans transition. The message to family members who have a service member that is either about to leave or is in the middle of a transition, what's your message to them?
So it's real easy to focus on the veteran as I don't want to call it the source of the problem, but the veteran is the one who's separated from the military. The veteran is the one going through all these changes. But in many cases, the families are going through just as many changes.
In what way?
Well, for instance, the veteran may be home a whole lot more, and that might be unfamiliar. They might have to worry differently about where money is coming from, where insurance is coming from, where the kids are going to go to school. A lot of these things are kind of programmatically baked into military life, and making more of the family stakeholders in those decisions can give them a sense of agency and a sense of power over their lives and over their destiny, and understanding that they are going through those things too. The thing about veterans that makes this change difficult is not that they are veterans, it's that they're human. And all of their family members are human too. So we're all going through this together. And recognizing that is one of the most powerful ways we can destigmatize the process and really accelerate growth. It's not anyone's fault or responsibility or burden or cross to bear. It's something that we all go through, and it's an opportunity for us to really grow as people and as a family.
So that's a really incredible background on not only your experiences, but I think tips and maybe an awareness for veterans who may have not considered this. I want to get into the book. First of all, Congratulations on what I'm sure feels like a milestone. We've talked a little bit off air about the interest that you have in writing, putting your thoughts on paper, and then putting them all together and publishing a book, I'm sure is an incredible feeling. And then after that, I want to get you to talk a little bit about your experience in corporate America, and maybe just some lessons learned, maybe tips for veterans who are going to be leaving school soon and transitioning into the workforce. So tell us what the background to the book. And then let's start. There's 3 modules. Let's start with module 1.
Okay. So the book is called Separating from Service: The Mental Health Handbook for Transitioning Veterans, and I wrote it both for individual veterans and their families and organizations that have an interest in helping veterans transition. So in this case, I'm thinking about like universities that might have veteran transition programs, or veteran service organizations, government agencies, or even military units themselves. And I've partnered with a few organizations from across these different verticals to help develop this. And the idea is that using this process, it's not like you're going to finish reading the book and all of a sudden be transitioned. Instead, you're going to have a much better idea of how this whole process works, and what are good things to do and what are not so good things to do. And when something that may be stimulating or alarming without that context happens, you can just respond to it. You don't have to think that it's like a big setback or a big milestone. Do you want to talk about each of the modules in turn?
Tell you what, I'll say, I'll ask you what's the most important maybe lesson for module 1, or what sticks out to you most about module 1.
Okay, so the book is separated into 3 different modules, and each one has kind of a different focus. The first one is all about best practices that you can do today to make the process easier. There are so many things that we do that really can prevent growth and that can prevent this process from happening in a much easier way. This is where I talk about like getting the right group of friends, quitting drinking, getting good exercise habits, taking care of your sleep. It's just like the most basic building blocks of a healthy transition. The second module is really about what the process of transition really looks like. And it's kind of 3 different steps: that differentiation, integration, awakening. And this isn't like a linear path. You don't just one day differentiate and then the next day integrate and then the next day awaken. It's iterative. So you look at one facet of your life and you say, okay, this is a thing that I can pay attention to today. I'm going to ignore some of the other stuff so I don't get overwhelmed. But today I want to pay attention to my relationship with my kid. And instead of thinking of them as like a private and I'm a sergeant and I'm going to discipline them and I'm going to bring them in, instead I'm going to say, that was a different context. This is my relationship here. I'm going to focus on separating that. I'm going to think about some of the ways that I can help this person grow that are loving and relational, and I'm going to awaken into parenthood with that new idea of how my relationship with my child should be. Mm-hmm. And that's just, that's kind of a heavy one, but there are lots of other ones that exist like that.
No, but I think the most important aspect to me in transition is what you said, is finding good people to be around, mm-hmm. and then the importance of your family. And if you're, a father or a mother and you're a veteran and you're trying to, alter the way that your brain works in order to interact more positively with the most important people in your life, this is a critical thing for veterans to be learning.
Okay, absolutely. Here's kind of a funny one. When I would talk to a person of authority, I would naturally either start to stand at parade rest or start to stand at attention. And I didn't realize that I was doing with it, but then I had this sort of Talladega Nights moment where I'm like, I don't know what to do with my hands.
Yeah. Well, Ricky
and so it took a little bit of self-awareness to be like, okay, what are other people around me doing whenever they're having these kinds of interactions, and how can I make myself feel less awkward?
Did you have somebody that you looked to then for growth within your family, that you said, okay, I'm going to try to learn how to be a better father or work with my kids in a different way? Who were you looking to, or what was maybe a situation that you were thinking about when you were writing this?
Well, I talked with my wife a lot. I talked with my coworkers a lot. And I talked with a handful of mentors who really worked hard to look after me. I found people that the world is full of smarter, wiser, more accomplished people that want to help people younger than them and less experienced. And some of those people were younger than me, and most of them were older than me. But what's really interesting about these people is that they want you to succeed, and the only thing they'll really ask of you is that you pay it forward and help other people as they're transitioning. And so I would mentor veterans that were coming out just a year or two behind me and help them through this whole process. And even through helping them through this process, I learned more about myself. I think that my therapist was one of the really, really important people to help me through this process. He got me into journaling to make sense of what was going on in my mind and around me. And he was a sounding board that I could just ask kind of ridiculous questions about what I was feeling and talk about what was going on.
Did it help you to get to almost see what you were feeling when you wrote it on a paper?
Yeah, so
to project it?
You don't realize necessarily. As humans, it's very hard for us to think about something conceptually without giving it a word or giving it a name or giving structure to the thought. So what happens is we'll have this real intense emotion according to some experience, and we have to process that and figure out what it is that we're actually feeling. Like maybe our spouse says something and it rubs us the wrong way, and you're like, why did you say that? And you kind of might feel defensive or aggressive to your spouse. That kind of intense reaction, most of the time what's happening is your body is remembering some past experience where that was really valid. And that's that resonant experience. Right. But you sit down and you journal and you're like, I got mad when my spouse did X, Y, Z. And when that happened, it really reminded me of this thing. Why am I mad at this person? Well, it's because they blah, blah, blah. And then you start recognizing there were assumptions under there. And maybe there was some other context, and maybe you thought something that they did. Yeah, it's totally learned behavior. And so you're writing this out, and you're like, oh, I had no idea that I was remembering this. Here's an interesting example. I know someone who got real afraid of, let me think of how to describe this. Basically, early on, they had a bad experience with a therapist. This was another veteran that I know. And the therapist had said, like, if I hear you talking about like violence again, I'm going to have to tell the authorities. Which is wholly inappropriate. I understand where that person was coming from, but it totally shut down this person. And I talked to them about 3 years later, and asked them how their transition going and how their therapy, and they're like, oh, after the first couple sessions, I stopped going because I don't want them to come and take me away from my family. Right. I was like, what?
That's not healthy. Yeah.
What are you talking about? And this person had been avoiding all of that, and through a couple of conversations, they realized that it was that one instance that had created all of that. A pattern that was totally unconscious about them not talking with anyone and not sharing these kinds of things because of that one experience. And it took some time from talking with them to figure that out.
How has the reception to the book been with veterans?
It's been really positive. It's kind of funny, actually. What I predicted when I wrote it was that the stigma of talking about mental health with veterans would prevent individual veterans from buying many copies. There would be a subset of veterans that are real interested in growth and like self-help kinds of things, and they would get it, but a lot of others would not. And so that was part of the reason why I wrote it as a program to help organizations that are already helping veterans to transition. It's going to be an addendum to their program. And so it happens that I got thousands of shares across all these different platforms of social media. And it got picked up by a couple of organizations. It's one of the best health books to read in 2019. And I got very, very few individual sales.
Interesting.
And what that tells me is all these people were saying, veterans should definitely read this. All of my veteran friends should read this, but I don't need it. I don't need it. But all of you should read it.
Do you feel like you have to overcome that when you speak to veterans?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there is a feeling of resistance and maybe shame in admitting that you need help, or admitting that you're going through a difficult period, which I have come to a point now that I know that I experienced that myself, but it's just unnecessary because we're all going through that sort of thing, and it's an experience totally common to veterans. And in one way or another, we all have to go through this kind of transition once we separate. And so what I sort of figured out is that not a lot of them are going to go out of their way to do this themselves, but if there's someone that they trust saying we're going to do this together, then they will.
If they do it in a group, or if they find an organization and they can read it together. And
absolutely. If they're on campus and they're the veteran transition counselor or whatever is like, okay, everyone, we're gonna go through this book, then they'll definitely participate. They'll do it when it's sort of prescriptive and when there's a group of people doing it and they're part of a cohort and it's just like part of the program, then they'll do it. But
what is one lesson when the veteran gets done with the book that you want them to take away?
The only way out is through. The only way out of all of this is through. I love hearing when someone says, well, I'm just not wired that way, and why can't I just get over it? This is getting over it. To get over any kind of intense experience or stressful experience or aggravating experience like that, you have to process it, and you have to make sense of it, and you have to find ways to grow from it. I just realized I didn't talk about the third module, and I'll touch on that briefly. When I talk about the second section, the third module is all about specific areas of your life and what they might look like in the military and what they might look like after. It's being conscious about how am I bringing my military self to work, and how does that fit and how does that not fit? How am I bringing my military self to my personal relationships, and how does that fit and how does that not fit? What about my values? This was a real interesting concept. We tend to think of military values as something that's given to us. And really what the military is saying is these are things that we value in people when we're working with them. So as long as you're working with us, try and reflect these.
Yes.
A common example is in the Army, we say like loyalty is one of the first Army values, right? But what's implicit in that is it's loyalty to the Army that the Army values. Mm-hmm. You can't say that that is a value that you yourself have because you're two separate entities, right?
Yes, yes.
And so being thoughtful about the things that you most value in your life and how you can progress towards those goals and how you can bring your military self to bring those forward and find organizations that align with those goals and align with your values, that's much more valuable than just saying like, well, the Army gave me my values.
Yeah, and I'm bringing them with me everywhere that I go.
Like selfless service, what does that mean in the context of not being in the Army? We have a really great idea of what it means when you're in service, but when you're out, things are different.
How do you apply that? Yeah.
Right.
So I want to change gears here just a little bit.
Sure.
Do you feel like you had enough time to talk about Module 3 as well? I just want to make sure that, and I just want to make sure that the audience kind of understands that it's awaken. Integrate? It's
differentiate, integrate, awaken. The first step is saying, that was then, this is now, I'm in a different place, and that's okay. I'm going to try and respond to this situation today as it is. The second part is saying, okay, well, I have all this experience from before, how do I bring that into now? And how are parts of me maybe underdeveloped that I've got to work on a little bit? You know, to draw like a weightlifting analogy. To draw a weightlifting analogy, you might realize that one leg is stronger than the other, and so you've got to focus on isolating that thing and working out a little bit more to bring it back into balance and into parity. And even the idea of doing a balanced press is different from working out one to get it strong, as strong as the other, right? That's how integration works. It's like taking these things and making them fit together in a seamless way. And the final part is awakening and recognizing when you've had that experience and can share it with others and really embrace that part of your life.
So you just mentioned a second ago about really being in the today. And for you, today is being in Austin, being a father. Also, you in your professional life are working in a very professional job with Google, and you're in a corporate environment. We discussed a little bit about some of the travels that you've kind of undertaken and that you've do on a day-to-day basis. What do you enjoy most about your day-to-day job?
I really love meeting all of these different people and hearing about hearing about their problems. I know that sounds absurd, but everybody has some kind of professional or personal problem, and it's not about offering them solutions right off the bat. I mean, that's definitely a part of corporate America, and it's definitely a part, I think it's a really important part of understanding, like you're never going to make it in business unless you can identify a problem that you can work towards.
And provide a solution.
Yeah, either solving or mitigating the pain of. But more to the point, man, people just really need to be heard and feel like the things that they're experiencing are valid. And when I get people to open up about what they're struggling with, like the sense of relief that they have in just feeling like somebody understands what they're going through is palpable. Like I can sense that we've sort of joined and we're in this together, when I can acknowledge that and say that sounds like a really difficult thing. How can I help, or tell me more about it, or just let's see how we can work together to come to a solution. A lot of people might feel like hearing other people's problems can be a downer, and sometimes it can. Sometimes it can be overwhelming, and sometimes it can be frustrating. But it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to help reframe things, to help people grow, to grow yourself, and to recognize what is human about all of us, right?
Well, Eric, I just want to thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for bringing us all the way up to the present and telling us about how you're still looking for ways to serve your community. And when we have veterans at this table, one theme that always comes through is that they're still leading and they're still serving. And it sounds like even in your corporate job in a day-to-day, you find ways to help people who are struggling. And they can be veterans, or they can be any walk of life. And I think that's such a great example to the Texas veterans and the veterans community. And your book is going to be a huge asset to veterans leaving the service as well as their families. We are going to put up your link for where we can find you on social media as well as the book. But do you mind telling the audience where they can follow you going forward?
Sure. So I am on Twitter at SepFromService or at Eric_Burleson. I also have a Facebook page for Separating from Service and have a website, separatingfromservice.com. Organizations that want to look into separating from service can find information on the website or contact me through there. And the book is available on Amazon.
Awesome. Thank you for being with us today. Best of continued success.
Thanks.
And I look forward to talking with you again in the future.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Follow us on Instagram at Voices of Vets, on Twitter at Voice of Veterans, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Voices of Veterans. To hear more, please visit voicesofveterans.org. Join us in sharing the success stories of Texas veterans. Thank you for joining us for the Next Gen Warrior podcast.